Okay, I'm Chris Lambacher, and I do Django-based web development for a company called Tindy. Tindy is the marketplace for makers. Some people like to call it Etsy for hardware. And we wanted to make it possible to help sellers integrate products that they list on their own sites and provide this simple integration with minimal code while allowing them to keep the branding that they have on Tindy. So the simple solution to this is obviously iframes, and from the consumer side of things, iframes are really easy, but if you've worked with iframes before, you know that there are generally a few problems, one of which is sizing and no ability for the CSS of the parent page to alter the CSS of the iframe. And then if you wanted to have multiple widgets on your page, then you'd end up with multiple full page loads. So anybody who does these things with iframes immediately regrets the decision. So the alternative is to do something with JavaScript-based widgets, but there's a couple of problems that you have to solve, including what happens if you're using a version of jQuery that conflicts with what's already on the page. You need to detect the location to insert the widget. If you're pulling information against an API, you may need a client-side templating language. And Squidget is a JavaScript widget framework that solves all these problems and a couple of others as well. So for the consumer, it's as easy as these basically 2 lines of code that are spread across multiple lines for space constraints. The top there is a div, and that gets inserted in the place where you're going to have the widget get inserted. And then there's that data Squidget settings in that div, and that allows you to customize at runtime what the widget is going to display. You can provide parameters in there. And then you want to put the script tag at the very bottom of the page, if possible, to make loading performance work well. And you may have noticed, or not, that the script there didn't have any funny naming. It was just a simple script name. And that means that whenever something changes, you have to worry about what's going to happen with browser caching. And if you have a lot of assets that you're sending, you don't want to not have the browser cache those. So we need to have a method of cache busting. And the fact is that Tindy.js for us is actually a Django direct-to-template templated JavaScript, which generates something like this. And the top portion there, you can see the static URL sticks out. That's some configuration information that the JavaScript is going to consume ultimately, including the CSS file to use. And then the bottom 5 or 6 lines there is dynamically creating a new script tag and then pointing the direction to the actual JavaScript that we want to load. And all of that stuff can be cached and on a CDN and all of those good things. And behind the scenes on the server, when we're deploying these things, we use a Django admin command to generate these files. We use Django compressor with our regular app to combine and minify CSS and JavaScript. And we abuse it for our widgets by hooking into the back end of Django compressor and generate one CSS file. And in this case, we're using less CSS to pick a subset of the CSS that we're going to use by pulling in just the portions that we need. And then we have one JavaScript file that contains the Squidget, the client-side templates, and all of our widget logic. So then you're going to want to get the data from your server to the widget. And in our case, we're using TastyPie, because that's the obvious choice on Django for APIs. And then we use jQuery and JSONP to get the data and work around same origin problems. And then because the template language that's part of Squidget doesn't have looping or conditionals, we can work around that by calling the render function multiple times, render with template, and just use jQuery map and regular JavaScript conditionals to do whatever logic we need for the rendering. Thanks for listening.